This is great. We got a great turnout here. I got a couple minutes after 7. I'm going to get started because we got a lot to talk about tonight. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is the whole market design of the grid in Texas. There's been a lot of controversy about this. Back in 2002, we made a bunch of changes to the way we sell and deliver electricity in Texas. It's been commonly referred to as the deregulation of the market. I've always thought that was maybe a little oversimplified. But ever since then, arguments have raged back and forth about whether consumers really benefited from the changes in 2002 or not. And so that's what we're going to be kicking around tonight. And is there a better way to do it than we're currently doing it? Let me start with a quick introduction of our panelists. Most of you have met these folks already, but let me just remind you who they are and what their expertise is. We have Pam Baden back with us tonight after a week off last week. Pam started as a geologist, but she transitioned into the energy business around the time of deregulation. She's very familiar with these energy markets, and you're going to be hearing quite a bit from her tonight. We have Jim Crump. He's an energy executive, mostly in downstream oil and gas, held positions at ExxonMobil, Anderson Consulting, and Shell. But he's also been studying this in his retirement from a sort of 50,000 foot level, and he's got a lot of observations. We have John Keller with us tonight. John is a little under the weather. That's why you're not seeing his picture, and whether he's going to be able to stay with us the whole time or not, I hope so, because John bought energy for AT&T was before he retired, and he is very familiar with these electric markets, and he's got a lot of valuable input. So John, hang in there with us if you can. Mark Miller is a retired petroleum engineer, former UT faculty member. He ran for the Railroad Commission, which regulates oil and gas in our state. He was endorsed by the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, and the San Antonio Express News. William Taggart is a longtime engineer, has worked on and offshore oil fields. Today, he's working on various renewable solutions, including an intriguing idea to use underground caverns to store energy that's produced during when we have abundance and then be able to draw on it, kind of like a battery. And then finally, we have Reed Williams. Reed is kind of our double hitter tonight. Reed's business career was in the oil and gas business, primarily in refinery, but he served two terms on the San Antonio City Council. And San Antonio is one of those cities in Texas that owns their own power company. And so after the storm last year, the mayor appointed Reed to chair a commission to look in what happened and what needs to be done to fix the problems as it related to San Antonio. They issued a very long, lengthy report and quite interesting. And he's now chairing something called a Rate Advisory Committee, which is looking at sort of ongoing issues about the San Antonio municipal utility system. And I think, Reed, y'all also own part of the South Texas nuclear plant, isn't that right?
We do.
Okay, so you'll have some input on that. So I want to start by kind of getting us all on the same page. And that is exactly what took place in 2002, what's been called the deregulation of the Texas electric market. Pam, you were around at the time and saw this firsthand. Can you kind of give us a little background about what we were doing before 2002 and how that changed after 2002?
Yeah, I think it's worth going back quite a ways. If you go back to the 70s, that's really when the initial phases of deregulation began. There were a conversion of events that happened. You might remember the Arab oil embargo. So the federal government was interested in reducing, generation dependence on oil. Utilities at the time were granted service territories. And within their territories, they were building facilities that they were guaranteed a rate of return on. And so that led a little bit to, maybe higher cost, not as efficient as it could have been. And they were also, the government was also interested in introducing more efficient technology. That was about the time that the combined cycle units were coming of age. And so in 1979, they created legislation that would introduce competition from third-party generators. So there was this sort of boutique mom and pop industry that grew up They were referred to at the time as independent power producers. And so what they did is, to the extent that they could generate energy at either at or below the avoided cost of the utility, then they were granted very long dated contracts in order to get the financing to put those facilities in place. So that's really kind of where it all began. And so if you fast forward from there, the Energy Policy Act of 1992 came into play, very similar to when gas deregulated several years prior. When that happened, third-party shippers were able to move natural gas on other people's pipelines. So very similarly to that, in 1992, electricity third-party entities could jump in and wheel electricity around on existing transmission. So that is really what it brought into play a lot of entities that didn't necessarily own generation, but they were buying and selling electricity around and delivering it around the market. That was before the NYMEX contract that eventually came into play. Generation, electricity hubs were created throughout the country. Then you had the advent of the independent system operators coming in slowly after that. And then if you fast forward after that, states would individually decide if they were going to embrace retail deregulation. So in 2002 in Texas, that's when there was a decision to embrace retail. So you went from wholesale generators competing with each other, wholesale marketers competing with each other, to retail marketers competing with each other. And each stage along the way, I can guarantee you there was price change for the better with respect to the consumer.
So John, you've been buying electricity for a long time. Is it, I want to make sure I understand. We really kind of have two segments right now. We have, before 2002, we had this sort of integrated electric system. We had people like CenterPoint or say the San Antonio that did everything. They generated the power, they delivered it, they run the lines, all that. But after 2002, we really sort of separated out the delivery system from the generation. Is that an oversimplification, or is that what happened?
No, that's exactly what happened. And when Texas regulated its market, it did it differently than any other state. Every other state left the regulated utility intact and said, oh, if you want to go off system and you think you can buy the power for less, you can shop and buy from this retail energy provider or just stay on the utility. Texas said, we're not going to stick our toe in the water. We're jumping right in. And they basically liquidated the generation side of the business, and the regulated power generator utility no longer existed. They spun them off, and the old TXU became Luminant, and now it's Vistra. But the wires company, the delivery side, stayed regulated. So that part of the Texas energy market is still regulated. The Encore in North Texas, the CenterPoint down in Houston, but the owners of the generation are no longer regulated, and they generate the power, and then that power, the marketers come in and buy the power from the wholesale generators, and they sell retail to the customers. If you didn't shop and choose a retail provider, you got assigned to one. So there aren't many people, but there's still some people who said, well, I'm more comfortable. I'm going to stay with TXU. I've been with them all these years. If you know anybody like that, they're on what they call POLR, POLR, provider of last resort, and they're paying about 18 cents a kilowatt hour. Tell them to get on the power or choose side, or suggest to go with almost anybody to save some money.
So as I understand it, we've really got two components to what you get as electric bill. You've got the cost of the generation, then you've got the cost of the delivery. The cost of the delivery is still regulated, but the cost of the generation is what's determined by market. Reed, am I correct on that, or is that
right? And so if you shop today on the power to choose site, The prices are up recently, but if you sign a 1-year contract today, it's a little under 11 cents. And roughly 4.5 cents of that is the wire company, and about 6.5 cents of that is the power.
Okay. Reed, how did that affect municipal utilities like San Antonio, the deregulation?
Well, if you go back to early 2000, what it really was is that certain areas opted in for competition. So areas that did not opt in stayed as they were. And that's like San Antonio, Austin, the REAs. We continue to have a certificated area that we serve with generation and distribution. We obviously pay for transmission through the ERCOT system, but it's really more of an opt-in. So in our particular case, we are still regulated from a production of power and a distribution of power basis. What we really have is we have kind of a bifurcated system in Texas, which is really unique. And I've tried to explain it to people in a very simplified way. We've got a field that looks like a football field, but we've got some people playing soccer and some people playing football. And you know, we're still in the regulated scheme of this. And I guess later on we'll get to talk about whether we think this has worked for the advantage of people, but I'll leave it there. Ours is a little different.
So Jim, you've been studying all this. You and I actually met. We were both trying to write about this and try to figure out what happened. I know you studied a lot over the last year, especially from a high level. What's your view on what we're doing here in Texas? Are we adequately describing what this deregulated market is, you think?
Let me take a quick look first at the residential market. And I want to mention a study by Ed Hurst, notable energy economist, who published a study, Houston Chronicle, last month, comparing ERCOT ratepayers to Texas ratepayers outside of ERCOT, and found, to my surprise, that ERCOT ratepayers are paying more. And the Hearst article referenced a Wall Street Journal article that made the same claim. Now, I'd like to, from my own experience, which has been petrochemical, refining petrochemical manufacturing with Shell and Exxon in Louisiana, Texas. Let me take a quick look at industrials. Given short notice timing, during the Uri storm, given very short notice timing of industrial load shed, industrial operators had to act real fast to enforce contractual force majeure terms to cut off customers from supplies of fuel, petrochemicals, olefins, and polyolefins, mainly polyethylene and polypropylene. Now, how did customers respond to that? As you'd expect, when some of those plants restarted, you know what? Some customers relegated those suppliers who cut them off to secondary supplier status, removed them from primary supplier to secondary status, regarding them as less reliable, and lost financial opportunity to this form of commercial harm. Well, to understand it would take a regional look back study, but after all, customers, industrial as well as residential, want reliable suppliers. So looking across the customer spectrum, I think that residential customers and industrial customers are not that different. Both want reliable supply.
Mark, you campaigned across the state talking about energy. What are you finding out there? Do you think most people understand what the electric market really is? And do you get a sense about whether most Texans are satisfied with what we've got, or and I'm talking about before Uri, did anybody really seem to be concerned about this issue one way or the other when you were out campaigning for road commissioner?
No, people didn't talk at all about it. And I have to admit, I didn't think about it very much either. It was just the electricity worked. Everything was good. It was my understanding when they did the deregulation, they kind of had two objectives. One of them was price, but the other one was Texas was not getting enough people to invest. And that could have been a real problem for everybody, industrial as well as residential people. But the part that we missed was the reliability part, even though it's in ERCOT's name. And I think that's what nobody was paying attention to, because up until Uri, it was reliable. I mean, stuff would go out during a rainstorm or something, and that was it. So I hope people are now paying attention to it. I suspect they're probably not. People didn't pay much attention to the Railroad Commission, even though it was probably the most important regulatory agency in Texas. And I can't imagine they were paying a lot of attention to the grid.
William, I'm going to come to you in a second because I want to talk about storage for a second. But I want to go back to Pam for a minute. And Pam, in our discussions, you've talked a lot about the sort of distortions or disruptions that are caused by primarily wind. Wind's really the only renewable that we have in any significant volume in Texas. Can you explain kind of what your views on that and how you see the effect that the introduction of large amounts of wind have had on the electric market?
Well, I don't want to use the word disruption because that I don't really think that word applies, but there's a lot of components here. So what people I don't think they really understand that. I think the average person thinks, oh, well, renewable energy, the wind blows, it's free energy. And the reality is the cost of renewable power is extremely expensive relative to its fossil fuel counterparts. Well, maybe not all of them, but generally it's more expensive. And then if you add to that the fact that most of this wind power comes from, it's scattered around, but a lot of it from West Texas, there's been a lot of investment in transmission lines to accommodate the wind power. And a lot of that, this is all coming out of the tax base because, wind is heavily subsidized, as is solar. And so even though solar prices actually have come down quite a bit, but the issue then is in how are those resources treated in the market? And so there's not, in my mind, and John can probably speak to this better than I can, but there's not an even playing field for those resources relative to their brethren generations. So for example, and we talked about this earlier, that if prices go low, and then sometimes in Texas they go negative, and I've seen it happen in other markets, wind power can still make money because they're subsidized, whereas your gas-fired facilities, for example, they, in some cases, they have to actually stay running even in negative environments because of operational issues or contractual issues. And so it's not only that these are dispatchable units, so they're supporting all of the wind energy that's intermittent, and they're still getting penalized in these market situations. So in a nutshell, I think it makes it difficult. And again, I am not investing in the market at this moment in terms of generation, but it would seem to me that that would be a disincentive for people to invest money into dispatchable resources, which we need at least through the transition until battery storage is fully capable and able to support our renewable energy, because it cannot right now. And when we talk about the fact that wind performed, well or whatever, there's no expectation for it to perform. So, saying that it performed well when there's it seems inconsistent. So these are just some of the points around renewables. And again, I want to make it clear that I'm all in favor of fuel diversity, but I think it has to be done in a way that doesn't put so much strain on the system and ensures reliability kind of, going forward into the future.
So let me see if I can summarize what I think y'all have told me here. So, we have the renewables, but the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And so you've got to have some power that's what y'all, I think, refer to as dispatchable, that you can crank up and say, okay, there's no wind today. Let's run the electric, let's run the natural gas generators. And I guess really most of our power in Texas either comes from natural gas or wind. We've got a little bit of nuclear, we've got a little bit of coal, but those are really the two big boys in the mix, as I understand it. And so the other question is there some way to store that energy that when we've got a lot of wind and a lot of solar and we're in these negative price situations, is there some way to store that? William, you've been working on a project, and can you just kind of tell us, in terms of trying to build enough big batteries or other kinds of solutions, where are we really on the ability to be able to store renewable energy that's not needed at the time?
Well, what America has is there's really three main areas. A lot of focus is on lithium-ion batteries right now. That's where a lot of people are spending money. But back in the 70s and 80s, what was called pump storage hydroelectric was made. And these were very large water reservoirs up in the mountains. Now, there's none in Texas because our terrain's too flat. But I think it's 23 gigawatts of pump storage capacity, and it stores like 530 gigawatt hours of electricity. Batteries have made a lot of it, have been coming along lately, lithium-ion batteries. There's some newer technologies which are redox flow. They're electrolytes that flow through a system. They're bigger than lithium ion. They're less efficient, but it's where a lot of technology development is going on. There's some farther out of stuff, which is the rust batteries. There's a couple of companies working on those. There is gravity energy storage. There's companies working on just lifting up weights and just using stacking weights to store energy. So the thing with the batteries that are being built here in Texas is, as I can't remember which one of the panelists mentioned this earlier, but they're 1 to 4 hours of storage. They're not a very deep energy storage. And you can see that the Department of Energy is making a big effort to look for 10-hour storage, something where you could store 10 hours of electricity during the night when we have low demand, and be able to bring that 10 hours of electricity back during the day when we have high demand, when the air conditioning units are running. That's what we need. I'm developing something to work in that area. There's a lot of other people working on it, compressed air energy storage, hydrogen. There's a lot of interest in this, but it's not there. And I think the thing is, because we've had cheap fossil fuel and we've had natural gas power generators that can speed up and slow down. And one of our people that we had on, one of the people that watched us a couple of weeks ago corrected me and said, you can do a coal power plant. You can change a coal power plant to change its power output. But right now, that changing of output from our fossil fuel plants has allowed us to not need storage. We've been avoiding the problem. Well, now the renewable penetration is to the point now where it's getting to the point where you need it. And that doesn't help us with our cost structure. One thing I want to go back to something that Pam said. I agree with her. There is a production tax credit for wind energy, but there's also a lot of tax credits for the drilling industry. So you don't have a direct tax credit in the fossil fuel power plants, but in the fossil fuel generators, there are a lot of tax credits. So there is, the fossil fuels kind of get subsidized a little bit as well. But yeah.
Well, one other thing I would add to what William is saying is, I think, demand side management, right? It would be a step in the right direction to help through the transition as well.
Tell us what you mean by demand side management.
Well, for years, there's been companies that have gone around and they have aggregated contracts with industrial customers. Jim, you might be aware of this, where a contract allows the company that's created the contract to cut the electricity to any given facility for X number of days a year, X number of days a month, X hours each time. And so once you get enough of those contracts put together, you aggregate those and you're essentially creating a virtual power plant. And so that can be another great tool to use, but, unless, the incentives have to be there for companies to be willing to do that. And it seems to work relatively well in the Northeast. The other thing I would say is just efficiency. If we could get more efficiency programs cranked up in Texas and across the state, there's a thing called property assessed clean energy that was actually started in California. And basically what that does is it helps people spread out the payments of the energy efficiency whatever it is they decide to do, whether it's solar, whether it's better light bulbs, better just
Insulation now.
yeah, that really hasn't worked. If you talk to any of the major, Heinz interest, for example, if you talk to them about doing energy efficiency in their buildings, it doesn't make sense because the payout is too long. But there are ways to work around that with certain, property assessed clean energy is one of them. But until prices get high enough, people don't care, and we're not there yet, apparently.
Jim, let me ask you, you and I talked early on about what the role was of especially wind coming in. And today, so much of the new capacity is wind. And I see several people are asking questions about, are we going to need more electricity in Texas going forward? And I think the answer is clearly we are. We're seeing all these big companies move in and plants and so forth. And right now, it seems like there is the investment incentives are to create more wind. And so we've had wind grow very rapidly and everything else stay pretty static.
Yeah.
I would say that coal plants have been shut down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Jim,
what I'd say is, yes, you got a point, Bill. And first of all, I doubt that anybody on this panel will deny the distortive effect of the production tax credit for wind. There's no doubt about it. And a result of the growth of wind is that gas has been relegated to a role of compensating for wind intermittency. Now, I think I want to go back to a couple of interesting points that Pam made. Yes, in the industrial world, interruptible contracts in a variety of flavors have been very important in managing the demand side for industrial consumption. The problem in the Uri storm, or one problem, a lot of that interruptible contracting behavior was based on the opportunity for Dow and Freeport and Shell and Deer Park to some extent to use natural gas generation for on-site generation. And some of those facilities during the Uri storm lost power and gas at the same time. So a couple of things, that form of interruption, which involved gas and power, was severe and unique. Yes, demand will rise in Texas. It will rise because population in Texas has grown 15% per decade over the last 2 decades. And I'm not aware that the drivers of first U.S. internal migration and other reasons for Texas population growth, they're not easing. They may, in fact, even be growing. And what is more, on the residential side, a problem with demand management, uniquely in Texas, or perhaps largely in Texas, is the substantial growth because of builder preferences over the last 50 years in electric resistance home heating. It was estimated recently that in 1970, 6 to 8% of Texas homes were heated by electric resistance heating. Today, more than 60%. So yes, demand will rise. And finally, I will not deny that the subsidy format for production, dispatchable production by wind, may have created a distortive effect. But what I would urge is, isn't that among us here, yes, Texans all, isn't a financial fact of life? After all, the production tax credit for wind and the investment tax credit for solar have been regularly and progressively extended since first enacted. And will that change? No, it won't, because of a very strong bipartisan congressional consensus. And so the difficulty that it may have created in unanticipated speed of wind growth, well, the tax credit aspect of that, I think is hard to, what's the point of arguing about it? It's with us, and so it will remain because of congressional consensus backed by millions of Americans who really are concerned about greenhouse gas abatement. So I think we need to learn to live with that. And as William has pointed out, the problem of intermittency could in the long run be solved by industrial and grid scale storage, which the technology is just sort of a gleam in our eye now, and the regrettable part is it's not with us at this point.
So, John, let me ask you to jump back in here for a minute on this. I especially like to hear your comments about this interruptible contracts, but what are your thoughts on the effect of this intermittency problem we're trying to get our arms around?
Well, we're still going to have the problem, and it's going to change a little bit. We've talked a lot about wind and the production tax credit, and they started in 2016 at 22.50 a megawatt hour and ratcheted down. They pretty much run their course. The incentive for solar is an investment tax credit, and they're kind of just now starting it at their peak. And so going forward, most of the renewable energy being added is going to be solar and not wind. And that the solar has a separate challenge in that in the evening as the sun sets, you lose all this generation. At the same time, the demand is increasing because everybody's coming home and the stoves are going on and the TVs are getting turned on and so on and so forth. So we're going to have that challenge of the mix of the generation in the state transitioning from now the interruptible is more solar than wind. And so we need to think about how we're going to address that challenge on top of the current one that we already have with the wind.
Yeah, and the same time that they're going home and turning on their TVs, they're plugging in their electric cars.
Exactly.
Well, that's a good point. Reed, obviously San Antonio has been growing like crazy here for the last decade or so. What are y'all looking at in terms of how you're going to solve future demand? And I'd also like you to comment on the nuclear piece for a second. Nuclear's gotten such a bad rap here in the last 20 years, but it sure seems like it's maybe something we ought to be thinking about. What has been y'all's experience with that? What's your thinking about nuclear going forward?
Well, let me just back up and answer your first question first. What we're seeing is you've got to have a portfolio of generators. It's been mentioned several times whether it was wind initially and now it looks like solar's coming on. I just don't see the cost advantage on wind right now over solar. It could change with the war we're in, but most of the folks are pretty much backing away from onshore wind and going to potentially offshore coastal wind. But we have to have a mix, and so we have quite a bit of wind and solar that we have under contract. And those and other stuff that we purchase are starting to degrade, as mentioned, our base load, which is our nuclear and coal. So you've seen the utilization of our coal plants go down. We have to keep the nukes going, but when they try to bid in, they've really been hurt by the wind and solar when they're operating. So what we've gone to is try to look at a portfolio that has enough generation, dispatchable generation from natural gas to offset that. So as we go through this portfolio, we're kind of looking at a 5-year time frame here to get ourselves in position so that the stuff that William is talking about gets commercialized and we can be quick adapters. So we're in the process of looking at converting one of our coal plants to natural gas. We're looking at some more combined cycle turbine and Hertz combinations. So it's got to be a portfolio. And going back to an earlier question, if you don't have that portfolio that can work together, in the old days you just had your fixed base load and then you had your peakers. Well, today we've got things going in all different directions. So it's not a two-dimensional problem anymore. And we've been very fortunate to be able to so far move in the right direction, I think. We've also got a lot of old natural gas steam plants that need to come down. A lot of the reliability and excess capacity is a holdover from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. In us groups that are still regulated, we've kept those going, but those are aging out, and we're going to have to pull those down and replace them with modern equipment. As far as the nuclear, I think when you go to the old turn it on, run it till you refuel it, it's going to be really tough to do those plants. In 2009, we backed off of a contract arrangement to expand one of our plants. It just doesn't make sense against natural gas. But I do believe we'll eventually see the commercialization of dispatchable nuclear. through one of these processes like TerraPower. So if we can get our nuclear situation going and we can get it dispatchable, I think it can fit in our portfolio very well. Thank you.
Reed, I noticed here that Rick asked a question about, is South Texas Nuclear ending the near of its, or is it
No.
nearing the end of its life?
No, we just got it renewed. I can't remember exactly how many years, but it's going to be around for a while. It's been recertified. So no, it's not ending. But the point is that things can operationally run, but do they economically run? And that's the thing we have to watch on these large not old, but these large, what I call turn them and run them nuclear plants, because you do not cycle those at all. I mean, that's just a fact. So it'll be more of economics than it will be, I think, end of operating life.
Mark, let me ask you a question. A big part of Texas government is financed by the oil severance tax. As we make this transition from fossil fuels to renewables, is that going to have a long-term effect on the finances for the state of Texas?
It'll have some, although our dependence on severance taxes is a lot less than it used to be. That's increased in the last few years with the shale revolution, because we tax oil and natural gas with severance taxes, and it will have to be replaced. It is still a significant part of our taxes. It's one of the reasons why we don't have an income tax. And so as that declines, we probably are going to have to find other sources of revenue for the state.
Okay, I want to ask you guys something. And John, this may be your question. We had Professor Craig ask us about, we have all this distributed production these days. People have solar panels on their roofs and everything, and they can sell that back to the power company under some circumstances. Why is there a price difference, he asked, between what he has to pay for it and what he gets to sell it back to? And then the second question was, why is there a limit on it? And I don't know, John, are you still with us there? He may have had to step away. Pam, can you address that?
A little bit, and probably not as well as John could, but essentially, there are two components: the generation and the delivery. And so when you're just generating, you would probably only get compensated for the generation and not what it takes to move it from your position into the grid. That's the short answer.
If I could, Bill, we've worked with this a lot here. We've got a lot of rooftop solar, and we do buy what they don't need. The problem is that the folks that are putting this rooftop solar on, they're not supporting in any way our fixed cost. Okay, our investment, if you would call it the backup power, that if they don't generate enough. And so we've looked at that, and so we don't limit how much people can sell back. And we are in the process of looking at, when you've got these two-way meters where you can receive and sell, is there a need to compensate for the fixed costs that we have in our backup power for them? That's a big issue right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that, Reed. Thank you.
John, I think you had some thoughts on this too, right?
Yeah, but both of those points are valid, and this is always controversial, and it's controversial everywhere in the country for those reasons. And so commercial industrial customers, they pay different rates for their electricity throughout the day. And so when people would have solar panels on their roof and they're putting power back on the grid, they're doing that when they have excess power, and so does the grid. So the grid's getting power when they don't need it, and then when they do need it, that's when the solar people are using theirs. So there's a mismatch between those two, and then it's we've got to, and it's the same thing with EV cars. It's people who have higher incomes tend to have the solar panels on their roof, but it's the ratepayers across the whole energy grid that are paying for the solar power to be reimbursed. So you've got less well-to-do people subsidizing the solar panels that are on the roofs of people who are more well-to-do.
So Professor Craig's asking who does the limitation? I guess it would be whoever you're contracted with for the retail power. Is that right?
Well, Bill, we don't limit how much they can put back to us, but the fee, as I remember, is pretty low. It's like $20 a megawatt or 20 cents a kW. So there's not a huge economic advantage. There's a lot of people that have been concerned that people will download power into a battery and then turn it back around and sell it back to us. And so, and again, that lower price, in a way, has discouraged that kind of use. It gives people some economic incentives to go ahead and put the power back to us so that their units keep working, but it doesn't give as much economic incentive to play the market with your batteries in your garage.
Okay, guys, we're down to just a little over 15 minutes. We got two big questions I want to ask y'all, and I'm going to go all the way around the horn here. So try to keep your answers to about a minute or so, because I want to hear from everybody. And the first big question is, have Texans saved money by this deregulation or not? John, I know you've had a whole little kerfuffle with a reporter up in Fort Worth about that. Why don't you start off and tell us what your view is of that?
My experience is that we have first that we've saved money, that the cost of the energy has been less in Texas than it has been elsewhere. And there's been studies and reports. The Wall Street Journal did one, and the reporter in the Dallas Morning News did, and they used the BLS data and EIA, Energy Information data. That data is flawed, and so are those studies. But then the other thing, to commercial industrial customers in a regulated environment, you can't hedge your cost. You can't fix your cost going forward. And that's important to commercial customers, so that they know that they have some certainty, one, in their budgets, and two, they have some certainty in their energy efficiency projects. And then that enhances the ability to pursue those energy efficiency projects, because you can nail down the economics, you know what they'll be.
Jim, saved us money or not?
Overall, yes. Oh, sorry. Was it me?
Yeah, Jim, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, study after study has shown that ERCOT is relatively low relative to other regions. But I want to bend the language here, Bill, from cost saving to benefit. I question the cost reliability benefit that has resulted from the ERCOT model, scarcity pricing only. And I think it's solvable. We talked about this last time, in part by interconnection to other grids, which I think bears careful examination. So overall average cost, yes. But the problem is the difficult to analyze, hard to assess long-range cost of devastating loss of reliability in a 1989 or 2011 or February 2021 type of event.
I think it's a great point. William, saved us money or not? You're on mute.
So I've been looking at the data, and price-wise, we're in about the middle of the pack. We're not the lowest, cheapest place, but we're way far away from being the most expensive. So I would have to go with dollar-wise, yes. But I've got to go with Jim on, it comes at a cost of, and we saw that in the Uri freeze. You know, the other areas that were not outside of ERCOT did not go down, and we went down.
Pay me now, pay me later, huh? Reed, saved us money or not?
Well, some have, some haven't. In our studies, what we found is that some customers, particularly industrial customers, have been able to do that. The retail standpoint, it's been very, very much harder for them. In our particular situation, our industrial and retail customers in our system are actually at a disadvantage to the deregulated, take it for example, the Houston market. So in our case, our retail customers are very competitive. Our industrial customers are not. And that is something that we are working on. So it actually depends on who you are and where you are as to whether you've saved. And actually it depends on how much work you want to put into it. Because if you're in one of the markets that is deregulated and you either don't watch it all the time or hire somebody to watch it, you can really get burned. So in a situation like we're in, we are spending a lot of time making sure the retail customers are very well taken care of. We've got to work very hard on our industrial and commercial customers. So it really does depend. It is not a yes, it's everybody wins and everybody loses. It depends on who you are and how hard you work at it.
Mark.
I have kind of a biased view. I'm served by a cooperative, and our prices are both lower than the average in Texas as well as below average nationally. And I have to say, during Uri, we had above average reliability. So, and I think there was a study out of University of Houston that showed that people that were in cooperatives, which are regulated, did better. And I'd have to say, I feel very good about what our cooperative was able to deliver.
Interesting. Pam, do you think we saved money or not?
Yes, I do. I think, in a way, if you think about, again, going back to subsidies for, maybe at the cost of other taxpayers, because of the great amount of wind that we have in our system relative to others, I would say. But I want to challenge the group a little bit on the reliability issue and this relative to the structure of the market. Because let's say, for example, that we were in a market that had, capacity payments, not just an energy only system. Even if you had been in that situation during Uri, if you had firm transport on your gas pipeline and even firm contract with your gas provider, that didn't make a difference in this situation. I don't know if we've given that a lot of thought or consideration in the group.
That's an interesting point. Okay, the second big question is there's been a whole host of people, especially in the media, saying that we ought to completely sack this unregulated model, to the extent you can really call it that, and go back to the integrated, fully regulated market like we had before. Does anybody here think that's a good idea? Is it possible to do that? And William, why don't you start off and give us your view?
I'm the technical guy, so this unwinding of market regulation, I'll defer to the rest of the group. From a technical standpoint, there's no technical blocks, but it is all about markets, and that's not my area.
Jim, what do you think?
It's hard for me to see a return to the pre-2002 regulation. The model was flawed, and I buy into the claim that under pre-2002 structure, regulated utilities grew fat and inefficient, as critics of that market design are so fond of saying. And I think that there are lessons which, if we learn them and apply them, can move us forward. Winterization is taking on new strength, and the gas and electric regulatory agencies, Railroad Commission and ERCOT, which earlier appeared to me to be toothless. Well, I think that both are growing teeth and beginning to make winterization compulsory, not purely advisory or discretionary. And I have to believe also, I'll repeat an earlier claim from an earlier webinar, that interconnection to other grids can help to shore up Texas supply in Uri-like cases, as well as provide commercially attractive sellout incentive to Texas providers. So returning to the 2002, I'm not in favor of returning to the flaws of the pre-2002 past.
So fix it, don't break it. Is that what you're saying?
Take the lessons, apply them, and fix what we have, rather than returning to the fat and inefficient, so to speak, behavior of the past. I think there's a tendency to romanticize the past in many ways, and I think that this is a case of that. I think that to squeeze out those inefficiencies was worthwhile. We need to just learn the current market and regulatory design lessons and apply them with greater vigor and confidence.
Reed, you are sort of in between here, the situation you're in. Do you think we ought to try to go back to the previous model or not? And I noticed James Reynolds asked the question, even if we went back, even if we had been in that old deregulated model and had a storm Erie, wouldn't it still have failed, is the question he's asking.
Yeah, it probably would have. I kind of take exception. I don't think the REAs, I don't think the municipal utilities are fat and inefficient. I think we work very hard to keep these things efficient for our folks, our owners, which is the REAs, and I'm a member of several. So I think we do have a bifurcated market. It is politics. It's not going back in the bottle because it's politics and you're not going to get it changed. I'd much rather see us try to get the regulation better. For example, try to move ERCOT out from under the PUC, maybe put them under a separate entity as a separate organization following legislative guidelines instead of political guidelines. It's still politics, but the further you can get it away from the political world, maybe you can get ERCOT a little bit more independent. And so I look at it that way. I don't think we're going to change it. I think there's models that work for both sides. And ultimately, we're going to have to get some pricing at the street that everybody that sells something to a consumer has got to be required to have some backup power in his portfolio or her portfolio. So if you control it at the sales point as opposed to the production point, I think we might have some ways of making these two systems work together.
Mark, what's your verdict on this?
I can't see us going back politically, but I would also say that my comment about the co-ops, we elect our board of directors directly for the co-op. They directly report to us. And my guess is if we had electric costs that were higher than the Texas average, they wouldn't be elected very long. So I think in spite of the fact that, I'm in a regulated environment, much like what Reed was talking about, they have to respond to us, the ratepayers, in a way that we benefit basically from the deregulation in the rest of the state.
Mark, do you do your own generation in that co-op, or are they buying it from outside?
It's a combination of both. I've never dug into that in any detail, but I think it's some of both.
Because I think some co-ops ended up in some financial problems because they were buying and they got stuck with this $9,000 kilowatt hour. And I think that happened, as I recall. I think Linda Curtis maybe knows something about
that was Brazos. Brazos is the one that's in bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Is it? Okay. John, you've been watching these markets for a while. Is there any way to put the genie back in the bottle?
I don't know how you do it, even if you wanted to. I don't know how you put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The egg's not only been cracked, it's been scrambled. Texas dissolved its regulated generation business 20 years ago. And so when you have a regulated utility, they have rate cases, they have regulatory attorneys, and so these generation companies, they don't have that. What about the wind farms? The wind farms some of the wind farms may be named for the company that bought all the power that came off there, and it might be operated by NRG or NextEra, but they're really owned by the people who financed them, JP Morgan, Bank of America. So we're going to tell Bank of America, oh, you're now a regulated utility provider. People have bought power for the wind farms. That power was purchased 15 years forward when that wind farm started. So what do you do about those contracts, all the hedges that people have bought power forward? And just the more you start walking through this, the bigger the mess that you realize that it'd be to do it. And then let's not forget, why did we deregulate in the first place? Because the prices were, because we thought we'd save some money by not doing it, the regulated utilities. tended to be inefficient at times. I do agree with Reed, though. We do need to get ERCOT, the Railroad Commission, however you structure them, under some sort of single set of authority so that there's coordination between them. So fix it. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Ms. Baden, we've saved the best for last.
Well,
Wrap it up.
I tend to agree with pretty everything that was said in this last go round. And I think John makes some really good points about the financial side of deregulation, allowing people to conduct their business with more certainty, given the ability to hedge and that sort of thing. So that's very helpful. And I was going to make one more point about that, but I've forgotten now what it was. So I guess I didn't really close it out as well as you wanted me to. Yeah, here's what I want to say about that. Also, just making sure that people who are participating in this market have a strong financial wherewithal, because when you get into a situation like Uri, you just need to have some big financial backing to be able to participate in this market. And that's one of the things that we need to make sure of going forward.
All right. Well, I can't believe it. We've already burned through this hour again. This has been a really fascinating conversation. For those of you out there in the audience, this is the third and final webinar we're going to have, at least for now, on this topic. These folks have agreed to keep meeting all on a semi-regular basis and exchanging information. And we may end up wanting to talk to all you about this again. We've invited a few other people who've been chiming in on the chat to join us in some of those. If you've got any interest in doing that, let us know. But I just want to reiterate that, the reason we're doing this is we're trying through this issue to demonstrate the philosophy of the SAM Party, which is that you can see these folks don't agree on everything, but they've gotten along. They haven't yelled at each other. They've gotten to be friends. They've exchanged ideas. They've learned from each other. I've seen opinions change over the course of the last year as they learn from each other. And that's what we ought to be doing, not screaming and yelling at each other, calling people names and screaming ideological talking points and culture wars. We're never going to get to solve the problems that really matter to Texans and to Americans that way. And that's what we're trying to do in the SAM Party, is build a party where people that care about having that kind of civil conversation and people that want pragmatic solutions to problems can come and have a voice in the political process, which those of us that consider ourselves in that camp certainly do not now. So if you're interested in that kind of political, those kind of politics, we have a home for you, the SAM Party. I would encourage you to go on joinsam.org and sign up and let us know that you're interested in hearing more about the party. We're rapidly building out the party in Texas. I think we get some very exciting news about some other groups we're going to be working with in the near future. And this is a movement. This is the time for a movement like this to return some sanity, civility back to our political life. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for all the support you've given Sam already. And we will be talking to you soon about other topics. Everybody have a good night.